Warmly welcome everyone to the last seminar of this fall, to be given by Ivan Miroshnikov on the topic of the Fayyūm, its dialects and its literature. Ivan received his PhD degree in biblical studies at Helsinki University in 2016, and his doctoral dissertation entitled The Gospel of Thomas and Plato, a study of the impact of Platonism on the fifth gospel, was published by Brill in 2018. He was admitted to the Professura Scientia program in 2019, nominated by Mid-Sweden University. And Ivan is also a senior research fellow at the Center for Egyptological Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and he's docent in early Christian and Coptic studies at the University of Helsinki. During recent years, Ivan's research interests have shifted from early Christian studies to Coptic philology, and he's currently working on publishing various hitherto unedited manuscripts in Coptic, both documentary and literary. He's especially enchanted with Coptic dialectology, an area of research focusing on the dialects of Coptic, which in many respects remained unexplored. In 2019, for instance, his publication of the first edition of fragments of the Epistle to the Hebrews, written in the early Boharic dialect of Coptic that he discovered at the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, became the fifth manuscript written in this dialect to be published. Quite an achievement. And he has published in journals such as Apocrypha and the Journal of Biblical Literature. He also has an article forthcoming next year in New Testament Studies. He's also co-editor and contributor to the book Women and Knowledge in Early Christianity that appeared with Brill in 2017. And he's been on several archaeological missions. I know that he was recently in Egypt, and I'm eager to hear about this. He's also very active in academic networks and in contributing to the development of the research field. For example, he's a member of the editorial board of the journal Egypt and Neighboring Countries. And I must mention that his knowledge of language is impressive. Ancient languages that he knows are Arabic, Coptic, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Old Nubic, and modern languages includes Russian, English, and German. So at the heart of his Professura project that he's now working on is a fascination with Coptic dialects, and an aim to make visible and accessible ancient languages by producing a database of literary manuscripts in Fayyūmic and Boharic. This also involves a comprehensive study of these literary manuscripts in themselves, textual fluidity being one dimension of study. And with this, warmly welcome, Ivan.
One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Christina. So today I'm going to talk about the Fayyūm, which is my favorite part of Egypt. What I'm going to talk about might be a bit exotic for some of you, and I personally don't feel very comfortable when I just talk for 40 minutes straight without being interrupted. So I would really ask you, if something that I'm saying is not making sense, or if you want me to explain a word, a term, a notion, if you disagree, please don't wait until the end, but just interrupt me and just say, stop, this doesn't make sense. Please do that, because this would be much easier for me. Then I would be able to better understand what's going on in the audience, and this would probably be more rewarding for all of us. So what I'm going to do today, my seminar will be of 3 parts. The first part will be an account of my recent adventures, because as you know, I did recently come from in Egypt, so I spent 10 days doing research in the Fayyūm, and of course you've all been counting minutes to this day when you can finally learn of what happened. So I'll start with that, and then I will try to give you more or less systematic overview of the Fayyūm in the first millennium, what sort of literature existed in this region, what sort of languages and dialects were used in this region, and so forth. And then the third part will be about the Fayyūmic dialect specifically. This is like the part that I'm especially excited about. So, but let's see how far we get. But as I said, please do interrupt me if you feel that something is not clear. So I will begin with just a few brief definitions. So first of all, I'm a Coptologist, so what I study is the Coptic language, Coptic culture. Where does this word come from? I don't really know ancient Egyptian. We have Sami Ulias here of the Department of Egyptology, so I'm not going to pretend to know that in front of him. But ultimately, the Egyptian term that I believe was one of the names of Memphis was eventually transcribed into Greek as Aegyptos, and then this Greek word eventually became started to sound in Arabic as Qibt. So this word Qibt or Qibti is actually the name that is today being used in Egyptian Arabic for the Christian population of Egypt. And from Arabic into all European languages came this word Copt or Coptic. However, this is not a name that existed in the language itself. So in Coptic, the self-designation would be Remen Keme, which literally means man of Egypt or man of black land. And if you wanted to say Egyptian language, you would say something like Ment Remen Keme, so man of black land ness, literally. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is the word Fayyūm. This one indeed comes from Coptic. It comes from the word yom, which means sea, with the definite article, so the sea. And the name refers to the lake that is located in the region that we now call the Fayyūm, and which is today called Birkat Karun. So in Arabic, this form was again transformed into what we now have, into the word Fayyūm. And then the Arabs added the definite article. So actually what we have in Arabic now, Al-Fayyūm, is the form that kind of has two definite articles, but that's kind of normal with place names. In Arabic medieval literature, you would sometimes find legends that would say that, if I'm not mistaken, some prince was building a castle or a palace for 1,000 days, Al-Fayyūm, and from this came the name of the region. But this is, of course, a folk etymology. That's not true. So, as I said, the first part will be an account of my recent adventures. So, I was in Egypt from the 20th to the 30th of November. And here is a map that would maybe give you some idea of what we are talking about. So this part is called Delta. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is Cairo, today's Cairo. And this part, the oasis, is called the Fayyūm. There is the lake that I mentioned. And then all the way down and down we go. And then here's the part of Egypt that's called the Sa'id, or the upper Egypt. So the Fayyūm is located somewhere maybe 70 kilometers from Cairo. And the trip that I took was actually to a place that is at the very border of the region, in the middle of a desert, in a village that is called Komushim. So there at this village, there is this site, which is called officially the Museum Storage, and that's basically where all archaeological missions in the area are supposed to store the objects that they discovered during their excavations. So I came to know that they have this very valuable manuscript that was discovered by the archaeological mission of the University of Pisa in the 1980s. And it took some detective work to actually figure out where exactly this object is stored. So, my best guess was that it was at this Collegium storage, and that's where we went, me and my colleague. So, as I said, it's about 70 kilometers from Cairo. So every day we would take this drive from Cairo to the Fayyūm. It would take 1 hour and 20 minutes one way, so it was quite exhausting, but fun. So this is how this building looks like. So basically just a big house full of boxes. And on the right, you can actually see one of such boxes. So basically what happened is that in the 1980s, the Italians put what they discovered during one of the seasons into this box. And then up until today, it was, staying in that box, and collecting dust. So it was actually very fortunate that, the prognosis kind of turned out to be correct. And then what I was looking for actually was in the box. So here is a somewhat bigger map of the Fayyūm. So this one is a map from the Coptic Encyclopedia, which gives you the most important sites of the area. So this is again the lake, and Collegium is somewhere here, not actually marked. And then the site that I'm interested in is here. It's called Medinet Madi. It's an ancient site which in the ancient times was called Narmute or Narmutis. And this site was excavated by the Italians for many years. And this is a map that shows the most important archaeological structures on site. And this is the one that I'm interested in, marked with the letter E. So that's where the Italians discovered the manuscript in question in 1987. These are pictures of the site. Unfortunately, I've never been to Medinet Madi. So these are from the journal publication from the 80s. So on the left, you can see the church, the one that's designated with the letter E. And on the right, you can see, this is the view from the inside of the church, looking at the entrance to the room where the manuscript was discovered. And then this is me. You can see that I'm balding. Me at the Collegium storage, trying to piece together fragments of one of the leaves of this manuscript. And then on the right, this is my colleague, Yelena Chepil of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who kindly did all the photography. And indeed, without her, this would have been impossible to do. So this is the photographs that Yelena took. You can see that basically what we have of this manuscript are two more or less complete leaves, a leaf being, an element of a codex that consists of 2 pages, right? So one leaf is 2 pages. So these are 2 different leaves, and you can see that it's indeed more or less intact. You can see also that it's huge. So, you see a ruler on the left. So every letter of this manuscript is almost 1 centimeter high, which is a lot. You can also see that it's written in 1 column. So that's also telling something, because the majority of manuscripts like this would be written in 2 columns. So 1 column actually indicates that this is a particular genre, that this sort of manuscript would contain some sort of instructional texts, and indeed that's the case. And you can see that the general appearance is quite nice. Like it's quite a beautiful manuscript. I would say it was quite a deluxe edition back in the day, and it's actually surprising that it's not a Bible, and it's not. And then here, this is something that I'm particularly proud of. So on the left, you can see the third leaf, which I was able to reconstruct from a bunch of small fragments. My guess is that when the Italians actually discovered this, it was complete, and then it fell apart when they were trying to take it out of the ground, and they didn't bother to try to restore it. And then on the right, again, what I'm very proud of is that I brought an ultraviolet lamp, and because this manuscript is actually written with iron-based inks, iron-based inks are very well reacting to ultraviolet light, so in a dark room you can see much, much more with the UV than with your normal eyes. And this is the lamp that I brought, and such an excellent thing, like the best investment in my life, 600 euro. So what kind of texts do we have preserved in this manuscript? So as I said, there's 3 leaves. 2 of these leaves preserve a text that is otherwise attested in a different dialect. It's a text with a very long title. So in this very long title, it goes, the questions of the deacons of the Church of Alexandria, Faustus and Timothy, before Saint Horsiesius the Archbishop, which they asked on the boat as they went to Alexandria. So this text belongs to this ancient genre of erotapokrisis, which is basically a list of questions and answers, composed for didactic purposes. And indeed, this is what it is. So here is one example, and this is a passage that was completely, especially difficult to make sense of, because here we have some grammatical problems in the Coptic, and also the text is partially lost. So a lot depends on how you try to restore the missing parts, the so-called lacunae. So here, one of the deacons, Faustus, asks, "My father, is it a good thing to make sacred vessels for the altar from gold and silver?" And then the Archbishop Horsiesius answers, "They are not as profitable to the Lord as their distribution among the needy." So, vessels made from gold and silver are not as valuable as the distribution of gold and silver among the needy. "And I say to you, it pleases the Lord, who spends his wealth on us, to give his garment to the needy." That is, for the Lord, the best thing to do is to give away the belongings to the needy. "For there is a modest vessel that is not suitable, or maybe that is not worthy of the required business of the Lord's altar, without gold and silver, and yet we know that the Lord receives their sacrifice from them with joy." They, referring now to presumably the people celebrating the Eucharist or whatever. So here is just one example of what kind of text that is. So it's a short question followed by a definitive answer, usually accompanied with some sort of biblical quotations. This is quite exciting for several reasons. First, because, as I said, this text is attested in a different manuscript, but in only one. And this other manuscript is actually in a different dialect. And as it often is the case, they are actually quite different. And this is, one of the examples of what Christina mentioned, the so-called phenomenon of textual fluidity. So, for instance, in this manuscript, the answer could be this long, and then in the other manuscript can be significantly shorter, significantly longer. Some parts can be omitted, and so forth. It's also quite exciting because, when comparing the Sahidic and the Fayyūmic version, we can ask the question of which one of the two was original. And in this case, because this text actually is full of biblical quotations, we can quite certainly say that the Sahidic text was original and the Fayyūmic is a translation. Because, as I will show later, the Fayyūmic and the Sahidic Bibles were actually quite different, and this text definitely follows the text of the Sahidic Bible. So it kind of Fayyūmicizes the Sahidic text. More on this later. So this is the text that survives on the 2 leaves that were more or less intact. And then there is this other text that I was able to piece together from small fragments. And that text is, as far as I know, completely unattested. So, I mean, of course, here I need to say that, this is as far as I know, because in the field of Coptic studies, it is very hard to know for sure if indeed there is no other attestation. In the case of Greek philology, we have this amazing databases where we can search for certain word combinations, lemma combinations, and then be more or less sure that in the entire corpus of Byzantine literature, there is no match. For Coptic, it's not as easy, so we can only rely on our general knowledge, erudition, stuff like that. But as far as I know, this stuff does not occur anywhere else. And what we have here is a homily. So it's a text that is pronounced by its author, and the author is referring to himself as I. Unfortunately, we don't know who that is. We can speculate that this might be someone historical, or it might be a pseudepigraphon, so it might be a text ascribed to some famous church father, which the Copts loved to do, but we cannot really know. What we do know is that this text is about fornication, and the fornication is actually like the key topic of this text. And here we have this beautiful rhetorical period in which the relationship between the body and the soul is compared to the relationship between a war horse and the soldier riding this war horse. So it goes like this. So too it happens when unreasoning animals in a visible war so too it happens with unreasoning animals in a visible war, when a horse ably seizes a soldier, probably meaning carries a soldier, and he, the soldier, receives victory in a garland, and it, the horse, is lauded for its fortitude. So too it is with the soul and the body. As with the horse, if it falls, and the soldier is killed, and the horse is taken captive, so too it is with the body. If it falls into fornication, the soul and the body will be burned. I think this is objectively cool, but what is also very exciting is that those of you who read your Plato would immediately recognize the imagery, because as you know, according to Plato, human soul consists of three parts: the reasonable part, the appetitive part, and the irascible, the part that is anger. And in Phaedrus, one of Plato's dialogue, this tripartite soul is usually is famously compared to a chariot. So there is a rider, a charioteer, which is the reasonable part, and the two horses, the appetitive and the irascible parts. And then the progress of human person is basically how the reasonable part manages to control the two other horses. So the connection between this and Plato is clear, but it's also clear that the connection is not straightforward. It's not like this guy actually read Plato. What I think is the missing link is this ascetic writer, Evagrius of Pontus, who wrote this very interesting text called The 8 Evil Thoughts, in which he plays with this sort of imagery and also compares human body with a horse and human mind with its rider. But in Evagrius, the kind of Platonic background of this is much clearer, because Evagrius is actually using the terminology of Plato's dialogues. Like, all of a sudden he uses the word charioteer, even though he's not talking about chariots. So what we have here is, a Christian adaptation or transformation of the, famous ancient Platonist image, and that's, I think, pretty exciting. So I would very tentatively argue that this is probably an original Coptic composition, which is inspired by this ascetic writer that I mentioned, who we know was actually translated into Coptic, and who wrote in a very concise, in a very short, laconic manner. so that our writer was probably trying to kind of expand this source text into a larger rhetorical discourse. And I think he did it quite nicely. So that's more or less what I did during my 10 days in Egypt. Any questions here? Yes, please. Yeah, so the question was, what are the rough dates? So Coptic paleography, I mean, basically there are two questions, right? First question is when the text was composed, and second question is when the manuscript was produced. So speaking about the manuscript, Coptic paleography is not a very reliable discipline. So, you know, in the history of research, there were famous scholars who would just point their finger at a photo of a manuscript and say, well, this is like the second half of, you know, 7th century. We don't do that anymore because really there are no objective criteria for that. Here, because this manuscript is written in a very particular dialect, we can be certain that it was produced not earlier than the 6th century CE. And because it's papyrus, we know that it's first millennium, because after the end of the first millennium, papyrus was no longer used for literary production. So somewhere in this interval, probably towards the earlier date, because the tendency would be that between the 6th and the 8th century, most of the manuscripts would be, in Fayyūmic, would be produced on papyrus and then afterwards on parchment, so skin. So I would say the manuscript is somewhere between 6th and 8th century. And then the text is probably, I mean, we have two texts. So the one that is this one, the one that's the Erotapokrisis, might be relatively early. But to be honest, I haven't explored this yet, and I don't think anybody actually suggested any dates for this. So I don't know, 4th, 5th century may be an option. And then for the homily, again, that's something that I will need to think on. But actually, you know, we cannot even exclude the possibility that the production of the manuscript and the composition of this text were very close, like that they didn't really, there was not a long period of time between them. More questions? Yes, Joya. So the question is, why is the size so large? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, so as I said, that one thing that we can know for certain, that because this text is instructional in its contents, it was written in one column. So because if it were a martyrdom or some sort of hagiographic text, it would probably be written in two. There's just a tendency that we can observe across the manuscripts. We can be quite certain that the large size probably indicates some sort of liturgical use, which is what the manuscripts were used for primarily in, you know, first millennium. But it doesn't explain why it's so particularly large. Like, it still could have been smaller than that. So I think there is a certain element of, you know, luxury to it, like that, you know, somebody wanted it to look good and to look fancy. No. So it's not poetry. It's completely prosaic, but it's actually, this is simply to show you the complex rhetorical structure of one of the episodes in this text. So it's not poetry, but I think it's, you know, relatively speaking, quite good literature. That's what I would say. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think this is one of those texts that would be performed like it's not any, you know, hymn or, you know, stuff like that. I think this was not meant to be performed with any sort of musical accompaniment, but Yes, please. Yep.
Prominence, or is that guesswork?
Yes, that's definitely guesswork. So we know very little about scribes, especially when it comes to manuscripts on papyrus. So manuscripts that come from, the period that I mentioned, like up to the 8th, 9th century. After that, we have this large collection of manuscripts on parchment, which actually have so-called colophons. So at the end of a literary text, the scribe would actually give us some information about themselves, about the donor who gave money to produce the manuscript, basically it's basically a message to the reader to say prayers about the scribe, and therefore the scribe gives us some information about themselves. So we know, for instance, that sometimes scribes were female, which is cool. Rarely, but still they existed. But before that, unfortunately, we don't know almost anything. And especially it's true for this manuscript, so the manuscripts that come from in the Fayyūmic dialect. And the thing is that we don't have a single manuscript in the Fayyūmic dialect that is complete. This manuscript it survives in 3 leaves, and one of them is in 25 fragments. That's actually very good. Like usually you would have 2 fragments and that's it. So unfortunately, we all will know almost nothing about the scribes. We can make a safe guess and say that they were monks, because that's where literacy kind of existed, prospered in the medieval Egypt. But that's it. Yes, Michael? That's an excellent question. Yes, as far as I know, Medinet Madi is one of those sites that were excavated properly and systematically. So as I said, this manuscript, and as far as I know, this is the only literary manuscript that comes from this discovery in Coptic, because they also found a bunch of stuff in Greek from earlier times. And so this is the only thing that they found, and they found it only in one of the churches, this one. So the interesting thing is that this room, so it says that it's southernmost room of the church. And in the Orthodox tradition, this is called the Diaconicon. So it's the room where, the deacons would keep their garments and the stuff they need for the liturgy, including books. So actually, it's kind of a logical place where you would find the books. But that's it. So unfortunately, I don't think archaeology is often of any help when it comes to studying texts. So it was found in a place where you would expect it to be found, basically. That's it. Yes? No, first of all, don't have sex. Full stop. Yeah, don't. It's bad for you. Yeah. So because it's a text composed for monastic people, for other monastic people, and I'm sure that throughout this literature, the idea would be that this is one of the gravest sins. So fornication means sex, any sort of sex. I mean, they would of course quote Apostle Paul, who says that marriage is sacred and the bed is pure, but this applies to laymen, and I would say that this sort of literature was not actually targeted at laymen. This text is actually exciting because it gives a certain string of biblical quotes and then produces a conclusion that I personally haven't found anywhere. So the conclusion is that at the final judgment, the apostles will preside at the judgment. So the apostles will judge everybody, including people in this room, for their sins, except for fornication, because fornication is such a great sin that God himself personally will judge people who did that. So it's clear that for the author of this text, this is like a big deal. And of course, if we look at various monastic rules which do survive, we do find a lot of rules that clearly indicate that this was an issue, right? So of course, a monk can, see a woman in a different monastery, or just a lay woman, and just have some thoughts about her, or God forbid, have sex with her. And then of course, homoerotic experiences were also well attested, because they are also discussed in great detail in this sort of literature. So if something is prohibited, it probably means that this existed, right? I mean, why would you prohibit something that doesn't exist? So that's clear, but I'm not sure we can really say more than that. Anything else, or should I proceed to the next portion? Yeah? Okay, so the second part was about, the point was to try to give you a more or less overall view of what actually was going on in the Fayyūm in late antiquity. So reading and writing in the Fayyūm. So first of all, because Egypt was such a rich country and such an important geopolitical region, lots of people came by, either to trade or to just invade. So we have at least 4 languages that made significant impact on the region during this period. So of course it's Coptic, which is the latest developmental stage of Egyptian. So it's basically the same language as whatever you see in hieroglyphs. The relationship would be like, Latin and Italian or stuff like that. Then there is Greek, of course, which was everywhere. Interestingly, there is Middle Persian, because Egypt was occupied by the Sassanid Iran for 10 years, and we have a large number of documents in the Pahlavi script from this 10 years of occupation. And then we have, of course, a lot of stuff in Arabic. And the funny thing is, which is something I discovered when preparing this, that the earliest document was produced, the earliest document in Arabic on papyrus was produced even before Egypt was completely conquered by the Muslims. So, we have extremely early documents on papyrus from Egypt. So speaking about Middle Persian is actually extremely important for us for dating reasons. And that's because, as I said, we have this very short window of 10 years when Middle Persian was around. So for instance, here, this is, I think, amazing. On the left, you have a very fragmentarily preserved biblical manuscript in the early Fayyūmic dialect on parchment. This is now in Vienna, which was reused by some Iranian clerks to inscribe some documentary text on top. So the stuff that you see like in black, like in this thick black strokes, is Middle Persian. And why is this important? Because we can be certain that the lower text, the Fayyūmic text, was produced before the Iranian occupation, because otherwise it would not be reused. It could not be reused for producing a document in Iranian. So this document is extremely important because we know that it was produced at least in the early 7th century, or maybe before that. On the right, you see a different object. So this is probably, oops, no? Yeah. This is probably a book cover, which we studied at another research trip that I took in early September. So there is a small manuscript collection at the University Museum of Perm State University. Perm being this city in the Ural region of Russia, which has, as I said, a small collection of papyri. So this object is probably some sort of, it's probably a book cover, which was made from reused papyrus. So a certain number of reused documents on papyrus were pressed together to produce a book cover. And when our conservator actually opened up this, this object, trying to separate the layers, we discovered this, and the thing that you see in the middle is again a document in Middle Persian, which, as far as I can understand, is impossible to read because it's not enough text, but you can see that there are some numerals here. Apparently this is a numeral. And why is this important? Again, because having this object among this other object suggests that all other objects also come from around the same time period, which is exciting because otherwise it's not very easy to date this stuff. Also, my colleagues who are now editing the Greek papyri from this item, they suggest that it comes from the Fayyūm based on onomastic data and other data. So again, very exciting. So even with Middle Persian, which was around for only 10 years, we actually have some really interesting things to say about the Fayyūm. But of course, my interest is mostly in Coptic. And the thing about Coptic, and that's, I hope, is one thing that you would remember. I don't know if it's of any use for you, but that's an important piece of information anyway, is that Coptic is actually not one language, but a bunch of languages. Last year, we had Nick Zayer with us, and he shared with me this amazing coinage by some, I think, Israeli scholar, that what are languages? Languages are dialects with armies and fleets. So, so the thing is that Copts did not have armies or fleets, and therefore what they left for us are dialects. But I mean, this is, I think, completely arbitrary. And with the same, like, there is no, I don't think there is any real reason why we should call those dialects and not languages. So speaking about those dialects/languages, basically what we today do, we say that the dialects of Coptic can be divided into two categories. One of those being early dialects, those that existed from 4th to the 6th century CE. And of those three, Sahidic, Fayyūmic, and Bacharic, kind of survived this period and lived on. And these three dialects are sometimes called major dialects. So those dialects that lived until, that saw the turn of the millennium. In case of the Sahidic dialect, the early variety was eventually superseded by the medieval variety, which we designate with the siglum F5, and the early variety of Bacharic, which is the dialect of the Delta, was superseded by the medieval variety, which is called, which is designated by the siglum B5. And then there is a bunch of other dialects, which I'm not going to mention, L4, L5, L6, the so-called Lycopolitan dialects, A, which is Akhmimic dialect, M, which is Mesochemic dialect, and so forth. So in the Fayyūm, we also had a certain selection of dialects available. And some of them, I would say, were quite exotic. So Christina today briefly mentioned early Bacharic. And indeed, so again, as you can see from this map, early Bacharic B4 is a dialect of the Delta. But we have some evidence for the existence of this dialect in the Fayyūm as well. So this is a book, a codex, in dialect B4, which contains school exercises, so groups of syllables, a list of biblical names, and then 2 passages from the Bible. And this book, according to the antiquities dealer who sold it to the University of Michigan, comes from Philadelphia, which is a site in the Fayyūm. Now, of course, in this case, we can say that, you know, antiquities dealers say all sorts of stuff, and this doesn't have to be true. But I personally find this particular piece of information possible. Like, this is something that I can personally accept. because sometimes antiquities dealers say things that just don't make any sense. Another dialect that we do have in the Fayyūm is sometimes designated by the letter K, or maybe better should be designated as semi-Bacharic. We don't even know if it's one dialect or maybe a bunch of dialects. It's basically 3 very small fragments that share certain linguistic features and therefore sometimes are united under this umbrella of semi-Bacharic. The reason why this dialect or dialects are designated with the letter K is that one of them was discovered at a site known Karanis, which is actually, if you've been paying attention, Karanis is actually the same thing as Komushim, so it's actually exactly where the museum storage from the first part of my talk is. So this object, the one that's again in Michigan, this one comes from Karanis. And then the thing is that the 2 other actually come not from the Fayyūm, but from the south. One comes from Deir el-Balayza and another from Antinopolis. So the idea to designate this dialect with letter K is kind of, it's not good. Because we don't really know that this, we don't really have any reason to think that this is particularly, this dialect is connected specifically to Karanis and not to some other site in Egypt. But we do know that texts in these dialects did exist in the region, so that's something. But of course, all this stuff is very minor, and the most important dialect in the history of Egyptian literature, Coptic literature, and in the Fayyūm is of course Sahidic. Sahidic being the dialect probably originally of Upper Egypt, but which very soon in the history of Coptic received this kind of international, so to say, status, and we find texts in Sahidic in all parts of Egypt. So the most important depository of manuscripts in Sahidic is the so-called White Monastery, which is all the way in Upper Egypt. So here is the map. So there it is, Anbashinuda, and the Fayyūm is here, so quite far away. Why do I bring this up? Because a very large amount of manuscripts that were deposited at the library of the White Monastery actually come from the Fayyūm, and specifically from a site that is known as Tuton. So again, here on the left you have a map of the Fayyūm, here is the lake, here is the Nile, and this is the area. And then in this area you have a map, and on this map you see a site that is called Tiptunis here, or Tiptunis is the ancient name, today it's called al-Baragat or Barajat, and then there is another village called Tutun. Now the theory is that actually this village called Tutun is something that kind of came about only in late Middle Ages, and that initially this site, that's the one that's called al-Baragat, was called Tiptunis, then Tuton, then Tutun, and then for some geological reason the village kind of moved over there. That's at least what people who study that think, and that makes sense. So basically the idea would be that Tiptunis, Tuton, and Tutun is the same place. And this is the place where there was a scriptorium, a very prolific scriptorium, which produced a large number of manuscripts for the White Monastery. This is one reason why we think that this scriptorium and the ancient site of Tiptunis are actually the same place. So on the left, you see an illustration from a manuscript which was produced in Teton. And on the right, you see a mural painting which is today completely lost, but which was photographed in early 20th century at al-Baragat. And you can see, for instance, that there is a chalice that a saint is holding on both images, and that this is they are indeed very similar. So, you know, arguments like that, which for some may not be very convincing, but they are usually used to argue that actually Tiptunis and Baragat, Tuton and Baragat is the same site. We also know how the scriptorium was abandoned, well, kinda. So there is a manuscript in Bacharic, which is currently housed at the Vatican in the Apostolic Library. And this manuscript contains a reader's note written in the year 1014. So what is a reader's note? It's when you have a manuscript and there is some empty space at the end of a manuscript, and somebody who read this manuscript decided to add something to fill this empty space to basically request prayers and stuff like that. So in this case, we have a deacon named Joseph who says that he is from Tuton, and who says that not only requests for prayers, but also tells us his life story. And here he says that he came to the monastery of St. Macarius, where this manuscript was produced, at the time when the churches and the monasteries of the Fayyūm were destroyed during the reign of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. So we know that in all likelihood, by this year, the scriptorium of Tuton was no more. Another interesting site in the Fayyūm is called Fanto, and this is a again an ancient site where we had a large monastery dedicated to Archangel Michael, and the connection with the with the monastery of with the scriptorium of the Tuton is that this monastery was also one of the recipients of the manuscripts produced at Tuton. The exciting part about this particular discovery is that the library of this manuscript monastery was discovered completely, almost intact. So we have 50-something complete codices that belonged to the library of this monastery, which were apparently hidden in some sort of a cistern, and then discovered, well, that's what they say, and then discovered by peasants. Then a very rich American financier basically bought the whole thing. So the largest part of this collection is now in New York. And the great thing about this discovery is that this is a very rare instance where we have a large selection of codices in their original binding. Why is this interesting for me? Because even though basically the whole library of this monastery is in the Sahidic dialect, there is stuff kind of hidden in the paste downs of these codices. So the paste down is this layer of protective material that is attached to the inner face of a codex to kind of solidify the cover. And in this monastery, many codices have covers whose paste downs were made of recycled manuscripts in Fayyūmic. So just to show you how it looks like, this is, for example, a cover of a codex that I particularly adore. So this is its upper cover, this is its lower cover. So this is called the outer face. Oops, sorry. So this is called the outer face, so the one that's kind of on the outside, and this is the inner face. So the inner face was covered by paste down, which looked like this. And you can see that the paste down is made up of several layers of parchment. And in case of this manuscript, these layers of parchment were actually separated from each other in the Vatican in the 1920s. And Here on the left, you can see how they look now. So on the left, you can see how the good people of the Vatican decided to kind of add this leaves extracted from parchments to the rest of the codex. And on the right, you can see a collage that I produced, which is made up of several fragments from the same face down, which were presumably cut into pieces at the bindery to, to become more useful for the purposes of producing the face down, but which can be actually kind of digitally reassembled and then to yield an entire complete leaf of text. So this stuff is in Fayyūmic, and if I had time, I would now transition to the third part of my talk. But perhaps it's better if we now take a break and again you ask me some questions, because I think it was a bit too much.
There's one question from the Zoom.
Okay.
Attendees. If I may start with
Yes.
from Jeremy Mumford, historian and incoming fellow. So the question is ancient Coptic Christianity seen as foundational to Russian Orthodoxy and civilization?
Could you say it again?
Is ancient Coptic Christianity
Mhm.
is ancient Coptic Christianity seen as foundational to Russian Orthodoxy and civilization?
Wow, okay. I mean, to some degree, yeah, I guess so, because Egypt, probably not historically, but according to legends, is the place where monasticism originated, and of course, Russian Orthodox tradition is very much about monasticism, and we have all this areas like in the north. There is this area called the New Thebaid, which is basically a federation of monasteries. So the idea is that the ideals of ancient Egyptian monasticism lived on in this northern parts of Russia, and of course this whole idea that Moscow is the third Rome, and therefore everything that is good about Christianity is embodied in Russian Christianity. But to an extent, because ultimately the Egyptians are heretics, right? They are not part of the Orthodox Commonwealth because they belong to this other tradition of Eastern Christianity, the non-Chalcedon variety. So they don't recognize the same ecumenical councils that the Russians do. So not as a foundation, but yeah, I guess in some way, yeah, the idea would be the same as with Rome or Constantinople, that whatever has been lost in Egypt re-emerged in Moscow. But that's probably more a question for somebody who studies Russian Orthodoxy, which is not me at all. Yes, Sami, please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, just a kind of a comment, really, not so much a question. The Hamuli material, or this Pierpoint Morgan material, the amount of Fayyūmic is actually larger, I would say, than it's not just restricted to the bindings, because everybody says that basically what you've got there is Saitic with Fayyūmic influences, but now we're working on those things, and now Matthias Miller says that actually it's the other way around in some cases, that you've got we're going to publish something quite soon, which is actually Fayyūmic with Saitic influences. So these things are really fluid. I always have a bit of a problem when people come and say this and that dialect and divide them even these minuscule categories, because you get this sort of a situation. But apart from that, Hamuli is actually linguistically exceedingly interesting, also from the indeed from the point of Fayyūmic studies.
Yeah, thank you. I agree completely. and I also am very much against this minuscule designations. I think they're stupid. I mean, I think ultimately we can say that, you know, there are manuscripts that clearly follow a certain dialectal standard. Like, for instance, the one papyrus fragment that I showed, it's, you know, you wouldn't expect, you know, forms that are not typical and well attested in Fayyūmic. But yes, when it comes to Hamuli, which is of course from a later period, we sometimes, you know, encounter a situation when Crum, the person who created the dictionary, would say that this is a Fayyūmic manuscript, and then somebody else would say, no, it's a Sahidic manuscript, and then, you know, what's the point of this discussion? But yes, completely agree that, and I think this is indeed something that we should explore more, that there is more to know about the Fayyūmic dialect than people usually think when talking about the Hamuli discovery. Yes, I agree, yeah. Thank you. Yes?
Two general things, really. It's not very detailed. What I would like to know, what's exactly the difference between a dialect and a language? What is the border? Because I have never understood this.
Yeah, because nobody knows.
Yeah.
Like, why is Swedish and Norwegian?
Yeah.
Why are they languages, even though educated Swedes and Norwegians can understand each other?
Yeah. So this can be a question for Valentina, probably not.
Yeah,
for
I mean, I think it's a political thing, as far as I can see. I mean, okay, I'm not a trained linguist. I actually went to a department of philosophy, so I may not know certain things. But as far as I can see, there is no really, you know, way to delimitate this. So it's just a matter of taste. But I guess Sami, who is a linguist, may know better.
No, I don't argue that, but I would like to react to that. So I think, you know, people talk, these terms are almost interchangeable now, but they shouldn't be, because, you know, even you're talking about a continuum and a scale, of course, but I always sort of had this vague idea that a dialect is still intelligible within a given, you know, a speech community. It's understood, but it displays quite formidable lexical and indeed syntactic, so that is to say structural differences. So, you know, English so-called dialects are basically just accents, because there is no structural differences, whereas, you know, you look at something like Karelian Finnish and something from the western coast, and there you can already talk about dialects. I don't know about Sweden that much, but I'm sure it's roughly the same situation here. But, you know, well, where do you draw the line? That is almost impossible. You said something about, you know, Coptic being several languages rather than dialects. I wouldn't agree, but then we can discuss that later.
Yeah.
Yeah, cheers.
No, I just, okay, one thing that I think is worth mentioning here, right, is that we have this obvious translational practice, right, so that we have texts that were translated from one dialect into the other, so apparently there was a need for that, which probably means that it was not understood well enough, so that you would probably, you had a demand for this sort of stuff. That's one thing. The other thing is that we actually have late colophons from manuscripts that, you know, describe the event of translating text from Sahidic to Bacharic. And in these colophons, they use the word aspi, which is the same word that is used for, you know, Greek or Latin, right? So, you know, a text is translated from the aspi of the south to the aspi of the north. So, again, it looks like from this text that for them there was no substantial difference between Sahidic and Bacharic and, say, Sahidic and Greek. But, I mean, of course, I'm not really insisting on any of this, and I wouldn't say that this is actually something that is relevant for what I do. But for some reason, this question about languages and dialects always come up in this discussion, so I need to say something. So I chose to say something provocative, and thank you for reacting to that, Sami. I can move to part 3 if you don't have any questions, and we need still 40 minutes to kill. Is this okay?
I have one
Oh, yeah.
question. Following up on this, since you indicate that it may have to do with politics,
Yeah.
what's considered language, what's considered dialect. So could it be the case, because you have these translations between dialects, that this was a sign of formation of some kind of, well, constituency, society, I don't know what, village state-based kind of community, that there was something political going on, therefore there was a need of translations?
I mean, that's a good question, but to my mind, I cannot come up with any like evidence for that. Like, obviously, there's this thing that's called Coptic Nationalism, which is a very, very bad expression. But basically, the idea is that in many first millennium texts, you would have this idea that Egypt is this promised land. It's better than anything else. It's where the Christianity is at its first. It's the land that's chosen by God from the beginning, and that's why there are so many monasteries there, and that's why there are so many monks there. So there is certainly this idea that Egyptian Christianity is select and superior to everything else. But I wouldn't say that there is any evidence that somebody, let's say in the Theban region, would say that we have this our own thing brewing here, which should be distinguished from. Like, that's not something that I am familiar with. But I mean, maybe it's just my ignorance. But that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so with this, I would like to move on to finally to talking about the part 3, which is more about what I actually do. So part 3 is about literature in the Fayyūmic Coptic. So we now know that there is this thing called Fayyūmic, which is basically a certain group of dialects which share common features. The most well-known of them is the so-called lambdacism, which means that the sound R is sometimes replaced with the sound L, unlike all other Coptic dialects. So what sort of literature survives in this kind of family of dialects? Basically 3 groups, nothing exciting here. Obviously, Egyptian literature is a Christian literature, Coptic literature is a Christian literature. So most of the stuff is translated from Greek. And as far as I know, exceptions are very rare. So we, for instance, have this Manichaean, so, non-Christian communities that came from Syria and therefore translated some stuff directly from Syriac. But that's extremely marginal. So the largest amount of texts that were translated into Coptic were translated from Greek. So the first group is, in this inventory, is texts that were translated into Fayyūmic directly from Greek. And of course here, the main group would be the most important group of text would be the biblical text, the canonical biblical text, Old and New Testament. The second group would be texts that were translated into Fayyūmic from the Sahidic dialect, which, as I said, was the dominant dialect. And this text can be divided into 2 subgroups, so texts that were initially composed in Sahidic, like a certain group of martyrdoms, for instance, and texts translated into Sahidic from Greek. So that we would have so-called daughter translations. So a text is first composed in Greek, then translated into Sahidic, and then the daughter version of this Sahidic translation is the Fayyūmic translation. And then finally, there is this mysterious groups of texts that might have been originally composed in Fayyūmic. But that's really still largely a mystery for me. So I would like to say a few words about the Bible, because that's something that is still not very well comprehended even by Coptologists, that actually there is more than one Coptic Bible. So of the 3 groups of dialects that I mentioned earlier, Sahidic, Fayyūmic, and Bacharic, we have 5 dialects, S for Sahidic, S4 for early Fayyūmic, F5 for medieval Fayyūmic, B4 for early Bukharic, and B5 for medieval Bukharic. And in these 5 dialects, we have 4 Bibles. And the situation in every single case is different, which is, I think, very exciting. So in Sahidic, we have the Sahidic version of the Bible, designated by the letters SA. And that Bible basically was transmitted in the same form for 1,000 years without much change. So it was pretty stable. That's not entirely true, and we have certain books of the Bible that actually were transmitted in several kind of different text types, but I'll omit these details. Then in Fayyūmic, the situation is different because the dialect changed. So certain norms shifted. So the early version of Fayyūmic was replaced by medieval version of Fayyūmic, and yet the Bible that exists in these 2 dialects is the same. So basically the difference between texts in F4 and F5 are only dialectal. They are not, they don't have anything to do with the meaning of the text. So it's the same text type, right? And then with Bukharic, again, the situation is different because with the dialect also changed the Bible. And with, in the early Bukharic dialect, we have this so-called Paleo-Bacharic Bible, which is extremely poorly preserved because Delta is such a humid region, so not so much stuff actually survives the humidity. And then in medieval Bukharic, in classical Bukharic, we have the so-called medieval Bukharic Bible, BO, which is the one that the Coptic Church is still using today. Now, the greatest mystery is the relationship between Fa and Bo. So the Fayyūmic Bible and the medieval Bukharic Bible, and that is because they are so similar. So this is the Coptic text of a passage from the first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 9. On the left, you have it in the Fayyūmic, and on the right, you have it in the Bukharic. The text goes as follows: "For I am the least of all the apostles. I am not worthy to be called apostle because I persecuted the church of God." So Paul is talking about himself. What is excellent about this is that first, you can see that all the differences are completely orthographical. Like, for instance, in Fayyūmic, the word for I would be anak. In Bukharic, the word for I would be anok. So that simply has to do with the vocalism of this dialect. But otherwise, they're the same. The difference is only here, for instance, where a different verb is used for persecute. But that again has to do with the different vocabulary of these dialects. But the text is exactly the same. And also it has this element, so Paul is saying here, I am the least of all the apostles, an element that is actually not in the Greek text. So these 2 versions of the Bible agree against the thousands of Greek biblical manuscripts in adding this bit. So this problem was actually recognized by the scholars, and there have been 2 solutions presented, and both are actually wrong. So one is the solution presented by Paul Kahle, who thought that the Bukharic Bible was original, and then the Fayyūmic Bible was simply a translation of the Bukharic. And the other solution was presented by Palotsky, who thought that it was otherwise. So Fayyūmic was original, Bukharic was a later translation. Now, this cannot be true, and that is, again, in the same epistle to the Corinthians, we can see that sometimes the 2 texts actually follow different Greek prototypes. So there is this episode where Paul is basically arguing against this, sectarian divisions in the community, and is saying, what then is Apollos and what is Paul? And that's the text on the on the right, which is believed to be original. And then at some point in Byzantine times, somebody thought that this is not very respectful to Paul, so why is he going second and not first? And therefore, they changed it to who then is Paul and who is Apollos. And the two Bibles, the Bacharic and the Fayyūmic, they too follow two different prototypes. Therefore, it's impossible that one is a direct translation of the other. Both must have consulted the Greek. Then, very briefly about the alternatives, which can get a bit more complicated. One alternative would be that the Fayyūmic Bible is a revision of the Bacharic Bible made in consultation with the Greek text. This, I believe, is, again, improbable. And that's because we actually have good reasons to think that the Bacharic Bible that we have today was produced as late as the 7th or the 8th century CE, whereas the Fayyūmic Bible, for instance, again, speaking about 1 Corinthians, the Fayyūmic Bible existed definitely before that. And this is an unpublished fragment that will be published in my forthcoming article, very small fragment, which is now at Oxford, which is of 1 Corinthians, and which preserves exactly the same text type than compared to what we have in later medieval Fayyūmic manuscripts. And therefore, we must assume that the Fayyūmic Bible actually predates the Bacharic Bible by several centuries. So this option is not possible. The other option would be the alternative, the reverse, that the Bacharic Bible is a revision of the Fayyūmic Bible, again made in consultation with the Greek text. And again, that is not likely. Why? Because we know that there was also this mysterious thing called the Paleo-Bacharic Bible. So this is a manuscript that I published in 2019, extremely beautiful biblical manuscript, which was brought to St. Petersburg from the Monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai, and which preserves the certain chapters from the Epistle to the Hebrews in the early Bacharic variety of Coptic. So what is exciting about it is that when you compare this text with the medieval text, with the one that the Coptic Church is using today, it's clear that this was the foundation, and what the Copts are using today is a heavily revised version thereof. It is clear that the Bacharic Bible is a revision of the Paleo-Bacharic Bible, and it's very likely that the entire Pauline corpus, if not the entire New Testament, went through the same revision process. Therefore, again, we need more complex solutions, and these solutions need to somehow take into account the Paleo-Bacharic text. Now, this becomes completely hypothetical because Paleo-Bacharic is so poorly preserved, we cannot really compare it to anything, to much things. But there are possible hypothetical scenarios that we can use. One that I like, even though it's impossible to prove. Come on. Okay. Well, the one that's on the bottom. So the option that I like is that we don't really need to decide what went first, the egg or the chicken. We can imagine that there were two groups of translators working in the Fayyūm and in the Delta, which are very close, and which actually simply shared notes. And we actually have examples from history of things like that. Like, for instance, in the history of the vocalization of the Quran and the Torah, we know that the two groups of people actually were working in the same region and, kind of in consultation with each other, so to say. So this is the part about the Bible. And if I may, I would like to say also a few words about the non-biblical texts, unless there are questions about the Bible. No? So the non-biblical texts are very many. And the terrible thing about the manuscripts that survive in Fayyūmic is their state of preservation. So here you can see how a Fayyūmic manuscript that I'm currently working on looked like 4 years ago, before me and my colleagues started working on that stuff. So this is a manuscript that is in the collection of Martinskøen in Oslo. It's actually many different manuscripts, so you can see that on the right, some fragments are written in different hands. So, it was a lot of, jigsaw puzzle work, which went relatively successfully. So this is a bifolio that we were able to reconstruct. A bifolio is basically two leaves, joined, that would be placed in different, that would together constitute a so-called choir. So here you have 2 pages, and then on the other side you would have another 2 pages, and you can see that most of it we reconstructed on site and were able to photograph, and then there is this one additional fragment that we placed afterwards, and therefore it's in a different color. Hopefully we will be able to do it physically when we go to Oslo next time, if COVID permits. So what is this manuscript? This is a very interesting manuscript which contains 2 texts. It begins with a martyrdom of Paphnutius, which is an Egyptian saint who was persecuted, who was martyred during the Great Persecution in the early 4th century CE. And then the second text is the one on the right, the Life of Anuphias, which was allegedly written by a certain guy who was also named Paphnutius. However, regardless of whether these people were historically real, it is clear that they could not have been, for us, it is clear that they could not have been the same person, because this other Paphnutius, if he existed, he must have existed somewhere later, somewhere in the second half of the 4th century or early first half of the 5th century. So what is exciting about this manuscript is that, in all likelihood, the people who composed this manuscript thought that this is actually the same guy, and that they would produce a sort of portfolio or dossier of Saint Paphnutius, who first wrote a text about another saint, Anuphias, and then, inspired by this, actually died a martyr. This stuff is not actually attested in the 1st millennium at all, not in Egypt, not anywhere else. So whoever produced this codex was actually, innovating. This is an example of literature that was transmitted, non-biblical literature, that was transmitted in the Fayyūmic dialect, and stuff that was most certainly translated, because both these texts were actually originally composed in Greek. The question is, were they translated directly from Greek or through the Sahidic intermediary? I think the latter is more likely, but this is still to be discussed. This is something that is still needs to be researched. And then very, very briefly, shortly, do we actually have any texts that were originally composed in Fayyūmic? And the answer is no idea. We definitely have texts that survive only in Fayyūmic and in no other dialect. But in some instances, it's pretty clear that Fayyūmic was not original. Like with the homily that I showed you, we can see that the original version was Sahidic because of the biblical quotations, because the text type of the Bible is Sahidic. So the text was originally composed in Sahidic, and the translator did not replace, the Sahidic wording with the Fayyūmic wording. He simply, translated the Sahidic text type, if it makes any sense. With some texts, it's harder to say. So this is a very early and very exciting object from the collection of Köln University Library, which is some sort of a dialogue between Jesus and the apostles about Egypt. And it actually kind of promotes the same idea that I mentioned before about Egypt being the select country, the most beloved land of God, which has the special status in God's eyes. I personally don't see any reason why it cannot be something that was originally composed in Fayyūmic, but again, methodologically speaking, it's extremely hard to make any conclusions from the lack of evidence. Because, you know, the main argument would be that we don't have it in any other language or dialect. And with this, I finally finish this presentation. I say to you, Miyat and Tona, which is thank you very much in Fayyūmic. Thank you very much.
Comments, questions? Margaret, please.
So, in the 16th century, when Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, was relating his life story to a scribe, I think he was dying of malaria, they ran out of scribes. So he started out, if I'm remembering correctly, in Spanish, though his original language was probably Basque. And then they switched scribes in the middle to somebody who, if I'm remembering correctly, wrote in Italian. And so the original manuscript is half in Spanish and half in Italian. So what this has always suggested to me was, first of all, they were mutually intelligible. And I mean, who knows what Loyola was speaking? It was some kind of Spanish being written down in Italian. And what's really always suggested to me is the fluidity of these kinds of dialects or languages, if you want to call them that. So I'm sort of the fluidity persuasion, but what I'm really wondering more, which I think this story also raises, is how different the spoken language might have been from what is written down, and what the role of scribes were in. Now, for example, if they simply ran out of a scribe that could write in one of these dialects and chose another one to fill in some piece of something, would it really make any profound difference in terms of the language that they were probably actually speaking? So it's really a question about the interchangeability of these, and also if there's anything at all that we can surmise about the difference in how these languages sounded as opposed to what they looked like when they were written down on the page, particularly since they were all using, as far as I could see, the same notation systems, but maybe not. You can, I'm sure, illuminate that. So it's the relationship between what's written, what's spoken, what's heard, and the just sort of problem of whether scribes can be expected always to be writing in one dialect.
Yeah, so it's, I think, like 5 different questions, but they're all great. Okay, so first of all, about this code switching thing. So I don't know anything about Loyola, but I would assume that, you know, he was surrounded by rather educated people who were he was surrounded by rather educated people.
Wasn't particular.
No?
Never went to school, and
Uh-huh.
but he certainly spoke a lot.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, but I mean, so to my knowledge, this sort of code switching does not really happen much. Like one example, amazing example, is this Manichaean corpus of documentary texts from the south. So Manichaeism was this amazing dualist religion that prospered in Egypt in the 4th century, but then kind of faded out. So these guys would usually begin letters in Greek, and then in the middle of a very complex, you know, rhetorically structured sentence, they would switch to Coptic. And that's unusual, and that's something that we don't encounter outside of this corpus. And there are different ways to explain why they did that, but one obvious reason is that they could. Like they knew their languages well enough, and it was one of the Manichaean, you know, one of the things that was valued in the Manichaean community, the ability to know and speak different languages, because you need to be able to, you know, be a missionary in different circumstances. In Coptic, we don't really, I don't really outside of this Manichaean corpus, I don't really know if we have any examples of that. We have texts that are, problematic, like what Sami mentioned, like, the text that we cannot really label very well. And that's the probably, the thing about the way we label things. Like, there are manuscripts that, some people would like to describe as mixtures, or, that, would at some point, written by the same scribe, at some point would exhibit elements that would be more typical for Sahidic. In other pages would exhibit traits that are typical for Fayyūmic, and, you wouldn't really understand what the scribe is doing, what kind of a standard he's trying to follow, but that's not the same thing, right? So I would say that the situation that you describe maybe is somewhat different from, like, I cannot really find any parallel to it in what I know. The question about the difference between the written language and the spoken language is also very interesting, and also it's extremely hard to answer, because we're dealing with a dead language, and we don't, of course, have any recordings of people actually talking Coptic. There is an excellent article by Sebastian Richter of Berlin, who studied the documentary texts where people are particularly angry. And, when you are angry, you are sometimes, like when you're accusing somebody, you are trying to quote them verbatim, or like to give a verbatim kind of narration of what happened, like, and then he said, and I told him. And then, in these instances, you actually do see that the spoken performance of Coptic was surely different from what we encounter in literary texts. But again, this is really just a few phrases spread across several texts. Because otherwise, even if you write a document, you're still not writing it in the same register as you speak, right? So, I mean, ultimately, I think we don't really know. And then the question about how it sounded, yeah, so again, the same problem. We kind of assume that the written system, to some extent, reflects the vocalization, right? So that, the differences in spelling between dialects indicate that there was also a difference in how it was pronounced. Because if it doesn't, then we cannot really say anything. But again, that's more of an assumption. Like, it's really not something we can prove, because this is that language.
Thank you. Further questions? Okay, Michael, Kawe, and yeah, we start there. See how far we get.
Yeah.
I have you, Joy, also on the list.
Thanks, Yvonne. I guess this is another riff on the politics question. But is there anybody today with a vested political interest in any of this, or is it at this point, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but is it purely an academic dispute?
I mean, that's a really excellent question. I mean, definitely there is this present-day Coptic community, and they have a certain self-identity. And the Coptic language, even though it's a dead language, plays an important role in that. But still, it's an Arabic-speaking community. So there is some, I assume there is some training in some, so, if you are curious, you can have some limited training in the Bacharic dialect, which is the liturgical dialect. But to go as far as to say that it has some political implications, I think, to my knowledge, no. Like, there were attempts to do some sort of, like, there was a sort of revivalist movement in early 20th century, like what they did with Hebrew, when they tried to, like, speak Coptic and produce, like, books where you would have, some sort of attempts for, children to like dictionaries, like how do you say train in Coptic? How do you say train in a language that died in Middle Ages? So the solution was that you just borrow it from Greek. So like when they did in the ancient times, you do it like, so, whatever train is in modern Greek, so you use that. But it never actually, as far as I know, it never yielded anything. So, unlike the Israelis, they didn't actually succeed. Did they?
No, they didn't. I have seen some of these sorts of.
Do you?
Managed to teach their children.
Hmm.
Being able to say, the helicopter. Prior to something like that. Language. Marks you as a Christian.
Mm.
Thank you. Kawe.
Well, I was quite intrigued by some of the photographs you showed us, of you sort of bent over piecing together these jigsaw puzzles. And I think it reveals a sort of research work that is quite far from what I'm used to. But I think I'm starting with this because there are different parts of the research of your narration. I mean, you went part 1, part 2, part 3, and every part sort of gives me a sense of what the project is about, I suppose, what the state of the research is at, both your what you're doing, but also the larger scholarly community. So one part, I mean, the first sense I got was that, what we are trying to reconstruct a dead language, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on understanding its alphabet and its vocabulary. You're trying to understand the relationship between this alphabet and another related language. So it seems to me that there's a lot of emphasis on reconstructing this language. And then at that point, when you shared with us this was it a poem? I suppose it's a poem about, so we're not just reconstructing a language, but also getting a glimpse of, I suppose, the cultural life or the religious life of monks, right? So we are sort of moving beyond just reconstructing languages.
Yeah.
And then towards the end, the third stage, where you talk to us about the biblical text, what came first, that question, which ultimately you said is probably not answerable, and that has all kinds of implications about world history, and there is really quite a large scale, a big question. So I'm just wondering where, for scholars that you're interacting with, what level is the research at? Are we still trying to, is the key effort still trying to reconstruct the language because we're still at the very elementary level? Or are we starting to use this language to ask these larger questions about history?
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing. Like, it's not really possible to do it in steps. So the reason why I'm interested in Fayyūmic is because, as you can see, it's a disaster. And it's very difficult, and therefore not so many people actually dived into that. And with every single new manuscript, you actually learn new facts about the language. Like, you all of a sudden discover new forms or new, patterns that were not attested before. But then, in order to actually, understand what's going on, you need to kind of look into the contents of it and see if it's the biblical text, like how it relates to the other versions of the Bible in the area. So you kind of obviously have to do everything at the same time. And the more you look into it, the more you realize that actually very little has been done. Especially what is surprising to me is that we actually have, a faculty of theology at every single university in Europe, and the discussion of the Fayyūmic and Bacharic Bibles have been stalled for forever, simply because nobody really wanted to look into that. So it's kind of surprising how very little has been said about this issue, even though it's kind of an important issue if you are in the business of studying, Bibles. But this is of course changing, because now there are these big projects of producing this so-called editio maior, so the the complete edition of the Greek New Testament, which by the way doesn't exist still. So in that edition they are going to make very extensive use of the so-called versions, and then also the Bacharic and Fayyūmic versions. So this is slowly changing. But yeah, so to answer your question, like I don't think you can actually do it in steps. Like we finish studying the language. When we know the language, then we proceed to studying the literature, and then the historical context and stuff like that. You just do all of this at once, and I think it's quite similar to what they had when they just discovered Greek literature, like in the early Renaissance. Like, you have this ocean of texts in front of you that you need to explore before you actually came to conclusion. So with Coptic, we still have that, because there is still an ocean of that, which we need to explore before we can come to conclusions.
Thank you. And Joya, the last question goes to you.
Thanks. Is it possible to date papyrus? Is it like paper? Do you have technical stuff able to do that? And something completely different. When you go to Egypt for your research trips, are the authorities from Egypt collaborative to you or not? Thank you.
Yeah, so as far as I know, the papyrus as a material, unlike paper, you cannot really do that. Like, you cannot study watermarks or stuff like that, because there are no watermarks. I mean, you can do all this very fancy chemical, what is it called, C14 analysis, which would give you some window of maybe 200 years. But usually, when it comes to paleography, I personally feel that this is not necessary in most cases, because usually, if you need a window of 200 years, you can probably guess it from the script. Like that you probably can extract from the script. But yeah, so as far as I know, no. But I mean, maybe in the future the technology will come up with some way of. The inks is different. Like with the inks, with the chemical makeup of the inks, you can say much more. But again, this is a very pricey technology. But I know that this is something that is being done recently now. That especially now that there is all this media coverage about forgeries and how do you recognize a forgery, and then actually ink analysis is apparently one. There are good techniques of doing that. And then about the authorities, I mean, yeah, the Egyptian authorities are generally speaking interested in foreigners coming and studying their material. So I personally have never encountered any opposition to me being there. But yeah, no, I don't think I can say anything bad about the Egyptian authorities here. No, I personally didn't have any bad experiences in this regard. No.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
Thank you.
Thank you.